in society. Architecture can be treated this way, or bureaucratic systems, food, absolutely anything can be archetypally psychologized this way. And in that process, we are seeing soul in the world. Everything becomes a manifestation of the soul's fantasies of itself projected outward onto the world. Everything that comes out of the human psyche, the human soul, is an imagination, and the human mind cannot even think or imagine without invoking these archetypes. So Hillman, as it were, is bringing the archetypes up out of the collective unconscious and sort of even putting them behind the sort of perceptual apparatus of the human mind. We can't think or perceive except through the lens of a specific god or goddess who will be relevant to that situation. And then in dehumanizing, he goes through and, or soul making, he goes through and discusses the Renaissance and his ideas about psychology is not a humanism and it's not a religion, despite its invocation of these gods, because theology takes gods literally and archetypal psychology takes them imaginally, metaphorically, and they're not to be regarded in that way. And he looks at the Renaissance and shows you some ideas there, which we won't get into. But those are the four main chapters, and the two most important, I would say, are pathologizing and psychologizing, that are most characteristically Hillman-esque. And if you decide to read any aspect of the book, I would read these two. And that would give you the sense of what Hillman is up to. So he's really up to an extension of the archetypes here. I mean, he's carrying these things out of psychology, out of the consulting room, into society, and out into almost every aspect of culture. And I'm a little bit nervous about that. I think it's a little bit, he's sort of transgressing the borders of psychology, and an expansion of the theory of archetypes I'm not sure is something that we need. I have my own sort of personal feelings about it. Seeing everything in terms of the archetypes kind of ends up with, a theory that everything must conform to an archetype, and that gets a little bit intolerant of
so that's what makes you nervous about it?
Yeah, I feel like Hillman actually has a concealed sort of power complex that is manifesting itself through this conquest of everything by archetypes, and I think it's carrying things a little bit too far. I respect it, and I like the idea, but I think it's going a little bit crazy with the archetypes.
Well, I like the personifying and the pathologizing thing, and you can work with that.
Yeah, definitely. Particularly the idea of seeing the archetypes in particular illnesses, psychopathological illnesses.
Yeah, looking for it's basically pattern recognition.
Yeah, and looking for the God that is seeking to be recognized there.
And I'm not really clear about the where the archetypes come in about reducing everything to an archetypal thing. I'm not quite sure how it gets there. Kind of lost.
Pretty much anything that's produced by the human imagination is subject to archetypes, just because it comes out of the imagination, and the imagination for him is just built up out of all these archetypes.
Kind of platonic.
Well, that's the other thing I don't care for in Hillman is, first of all, the reduction of all archetypes to Greek gods. This gets rid of the mandala, this gets rid of all geometric archetypes, gets rid of all that. It's a nice move for simplicity's sake, but it's a little bit too reductive, I think. And number two, everything is Greek. I mean, Hillman, he doesn't go outside of anything that isn't Greek. Or Plato, there's a kind of resurgence of Plato and Platonizing, and archetypes are really static.
They're
very
static. Platonic.
It's extraordinary. I mean, that's the essence of it, is this kind of modern updating of Plato's philosophy. And that can get a bit masculinist, and it can also get a bit the failure of the Jungian theory of archetypes, and particularly since it derives from the Platonic theory of forms, is that it doesn't take history into account. It never takes time into account. These archetypes are these sort of frozen cookie molds, and they personify different modes and different attitudes, but they don't show things evolving and growing over time.
And it's also
no
kind of
discussion
an
of history
imposition from above also.
Yeah. Even though Hillman would say, well, we're not getting into saying that the archetypes are out there, they're just metaphors. So he's constantly saying myths are just metaphors. And he's sort of consistent with Campbell in that sense, where myths are metaphors. And that was Campbell's major hermeneutic failing, as far as I was concerned, is reducing all myths to just metaphors. I think there's a lot more going on in mythology than just metaphors. For example,
so
how
he
do we
tries
know?
to weasel out of it, but it doesn't really, because it sounds to me like trying to weasel out of what he's actually saying, which is like basically just platonic form.
Platonizing,
Well, maybe
yeah.
just trying to focus.
Yeah, there's that.
Out of it.
Yeah.
it's like it's denial of history.
Yeah, it doesn't really take history
All right,
into account. I mean, history is always the weak point of Jungians. The strong point of Campbell was getting into the historical transformations. These, when did these archetypes come in? I mean, they're not just these statues. I mean, we forget that Plato's theory of the forms is a translation into philosophy of the Greek love of sculpting things. That's all it is this love for these static plastic forms that the Greeks loved, and nobody rivaled them at doing it. Nobody. And it's a kind of, it's equivalent, and these things are just, a sculpture is just pure space. There's no time aspect to it. It's occupying space. It's frozen time. It's divorced from time, divorced from history. Whereas something like literature or music flows through time. Those are time arts. And the archetypal theory is derived from sculpture more than anything else.
It's not very quantum.
No. Yes.
What do you do with archetypes that are new, alien beings and
That's another thing. Hillman never, and in Hillman too, it becomes very annoying because he never makes any references to the modern world at all. There are no references to any contemporary movies, novels. I mean, nothing. It's like he's living in the past. I mean, he is even less involved with the modern world than Jung was in his time. And Jung was pretty conservative and didn't like modern art. But he could appreciate, the recent arts of Wagner and so forth. But Hillman makes no references whatsoever to anything going on today, now. Extraterrestrial myths, precisely what you're saying. I wrote an essay on the biomechanical archetype, which was something that I saw as a new kind of archetype, which has to do with the fusion of the flesh and machines and images that we find. This is a relatively recent kind of... Yes, that's an example of it. This is a relatively recent kind of archetype that's evolved. Archetypes, they come into being at specific times. They're not just these out there like constellations.
And it's heralding a major change. It was interesting. We were talking about this in a group that I go to, where somebody was complaining about cell phones on the road. I'm like, well, complain away, because this is just a very quick little phase. Pretty soon it'll be implanted. And you won't see people talking like this because it'll be implanted. And this is not very far off.
Yeah.
So this whole merger of machine and flesh and on the myths around it are what's bringing us to the reality that we're heading for very quickly.
Myths of the machine, a whole new gamut there.
So maybe one can look at myth as that which prepares us for the future.
Could be, yes.
I mean, in that instance, actually, you can go, especially with things changing so quickly now, like what our new myths are heralding actual changes. I mean, look at 1984. Written early in this century, and that all came true, and it's still coming true.
Yeah.
So
Very prophetic.
Yeah.
A lot of time before 1984.
Yeah.
Right.
So what did you say on this
Biomechanical essay?
Yeah.
I just looked at 3 specific examples of it. The example in Thomas Pynchon's novel V, where he has, that's an incredible novel. There he has this fascination with this mysterious woman, and there's a character who's trying to figure out who she is and why she keeps appearing at particular moments in history that always have to do with a crisis. She's connected with the with World War I, and she actually ends up dying. And the image that I sort of analyzed was the image of her death in World War II. She dies on the island of Malta, and there's a bombing raid that comes in, and she happens to be in a house. And the house just sort of collapses on her, and she's left for dead there. And all these kids sort of wander in after the bombing raid has happened, and she's lying there, and they start pulling her apart because her body has become gradually biomechanized. They sort of pull off a wig, and she has a tattoo of the crucifixion. And one of her eyes is a fake eye, and it has a little clock on one of the irises. And then she has a sapphire sewn into her belly button, and she has an artificial knee. And they just start pulling her apart, pulling all these bits and pieces of her off. And I just sort of looked at that as the coming dismantling of the mechanistic civilization by new generations who will get sick of the machines, and they'll start pulling them apart. There's a kind of Ludditism, a